Hello and good evening from wherever you're watching. I am Johnny Cordova, NHA board member and director for Region 7, which includes New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. Welcome to our second webinar on the art of fact-checking for Palabra, a multimedia platform for NHJ. This is the second in a series in collaboration with Palabra and NHJ's Region 7. So again, like I said, I'm very honored and humbled to be here. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Palabra's current managing editor, Valeria Fernandez, who you see right now on the screen. And she is an NHA member in Arizona. Just really quick, Palabra just celebrated its 4th anniversary on November 5th. During these 4 years, it's collaborated with over 100 contributors for original stories in both English and Spanish. And most of these journalists are freelancers, allowing them to pursue projects no one else in mainstream media is pursuing. So let's get right to the art of fact-checking. And here is Valeria with a special guest.
Yes. Hi, Johnny. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you that are joining us. I believe that the meeting is being recorded, so if you have to jump out earlier, you'll be able to find it in a YouTube channel. We'll send you a little update at the end with materials from the presentation. And so I want to jump right in and introduce here our guest of honor. I'm super excited to have Julie Juidert Colasso. I hope I pronounce your name right, Julie. And she is joining us from, may I say where you're joining us from, Julie?
Yes, of course.
All the way from Mexico City, because Palabra is very international. And that should be a topic for a good story. We have contributors not only all over the United States, but in Latin America too. Julie, bienvenida. Thank you for being here. I want to ask you the first very basic question. What is fact-checking?
Well, fortunately, the name tells us exactly what it is, right? It's checking all the facts. But I think what we often forget, even those of us who are seasoned journalists, you and I were talking the other day, and I was saying that I was fact-checked earlier this year for Palabra, which was an eye-opening experience for me, even though I fact-check every day for Palabra and for other outlets. Fact-checking is really making sure that we're not making assumptions about what we believe to be true, right? So this is important whether we're generalist reporters or whether we're specialists who follow a particular beat, and sometimes even more if we're specialists, because we come over time, right, to assume that we have deep knowledge in a specific area, and we probably do, but knowledge can change, right? And it can also we can misunderstand it and we can take it for granted. And so really the fact-checking process is looking acutely, minuciosamente, right, at every single piece of information and claim in an article that we publish.
Julie, I failed to mention when I introduced you that you're a writer, you're a travel writer, also you're an editor. You do a lot of fact-checking for many prominent publications. But how do you get into this aspect of journalism specifically, which is fact-checking?
Well, I fell into it, I think, like a lot of fact checkers have. There is now training for fact checkers, not necessarily at the university level, but I will say, for example, Massachusetts Institute of Technology has a wonderful, very accessible program. The Knight Science Journalism Initiative has a fact-checking workshop that's held usually every quarter that people can sign up for. I often facilitate roundtables for their workshop, and I've found it really instructive as well. Even if you're not a science journalist, I think it's really useful. I fell into fact-checking as an adjacent task to a lot of the other work that I do. So I sit on lots of different sides of the editorial desk. As you said, I'm a writer, I'm an editor, I'm a translator. And so I was initially approached by California Sunday Magazine, which no longer exists, more than 10 years ago to fact check an article that required both linguistic and cultural competency. And that really sort of became my calling card, is that editors then began to refer me one to another, saying, this is a person who is fluent in Spanish, so can check articles that require being able to be in touch with sources who are predominantly Spanish speaking or only Spanish speaking, but also that really understand some of the nuances in terms of cultural competence, being sensitive to subjects about whom we're reporting, for example. And so that's how I really fell into it. I have, there's a great expression, aprendí caminando, right? Then I've definitely like learned fact checking while I've been doing it. It's the whole building the plane while you're flying it kind of thing. So fortunately, there are tons of excellent tools out there, and we'll talk about some of those today, that journalists can rely upon, whether they're fact checking their own work or whether they're interested in getting into fact checking as another sort of, option in their freelance work.
Thank you. That is really cool. I mean, that's another option for a lot of you. I want to acknowledge that we're being joined by our surprise guest, journalist Iris Amador, who's also does translations, and she's going to assist us today, providing a simultaneous translation in Spanish in case some of you want it. So what you will do, I mean, this is the first time we're doing this, is that you will go and click at the bottom. You see interpretation. You select Spanish as the option we have right now, and then you'll be able to hear Iris talking on a separate channel and our voices in the background. So if any of you wants to give it a try to do that, if you don't mind, it's the first time we're doing it. Maybe Yunuen, who's joining us from New York, could test it and let us know if it works. So it is, do you want to try it and see? I don't know if you have to unmute yourself or what will happen with this feature, but maybe you want to try empezar a traducir y ver si eso funciona para los usuarios del otro lado. Oh, yes. Yeah. So we're not listening to Iris here in this channel because she's on the interpretation channel. So that's perfect. Iris, carry on, because this could be helpful also to people joining us in the recording in the future. So Julie, following up on the question of how you got into it, as journalists, there's always the conversation of the responsibility that we have to our stories about getting all the facts right, dotting all the T's and all of that, making sure the quotes are correct. What is your advice for reporters themselves that may not have a fact checker reviewing their work after the fact or supporting them to become their own fact checkers?
Right. This is really critical, right? You and I have talked about not knowing exactly how many outlets in the United States hire fact checkers. There are a handful that I could name, but I think that it's really important to think of ourselves as fact checkers of our own work, regardless of what the conditions are at a publication. And that's not just out of respect for one's sources, although I think that's definitely a primary motivation. It's really also, above all, to protect yourself. I think, especially today with the culture, sort of a cancel culture, a culture where everybody's an expert, right? And can pick apart your work online, particularly if you are reporting or working in a highly contested area like migration that I do a lot of work in. I think that you have to really have the motivation to bulletproof your own work, so that on the chance that someone does come and question your credibility or question accuracy, you have for yourself, above all, right, and for your subjects and for the outlet, this sort of corporate people called it a shared source of truth, right? You have this shared repository that you share with your editor and anybody else at the publication to really say, this is where I have housed all of my facts, and these are what all the facts are. And so I think that when you do that, it also is a really incredible exercise in self-reflection about how you tell stories. It's and about how you report, right? And so it actually makes you a lot more cognizant and conscientious about how you go about reporting from the get-go. And so if you are fact checking yourself as you go along, and we'll talk about how do you do that and what that means exactly, you're really sort of creating this unassailable record of your integrity as a journalist and ensuring that your sources receive the maximum protection and respect from you.
So, and not to minimize that last point, because it's so important to protect our sources, but on a funny note, you have to CYA as you go. So,
Right. Right.
So don't forget that, but it's also this other component. Will you say that there are golden rules of fact checking that I want you to talk about, but maybe you want to start with this one, right? How does it look like to fact check as you go? What kind of processes do you have to set in place to do that the right way?
So the way that I like to think about this is that you create a crumb of bread trail, a trail of breadcrumbs for yourself, right? That you can follow back if necessary. So as you start reporting, I think it's ideal to create a Google Drive folder for yourself. And all the suggestions that I'm making are things that you can adapt to your own platforms and what you use and the tools that you rely upon. And also, as you start doing this for yourself, or as you start adapting this, if you're already doing this, you'll find systems and processes that work best for you. But if you can set up a folder for yourself that really serves as the central repository for everything from audio interviews to transcripts of those interviews, if you use WhatsApp or text or email to converse with your subjects, to create screenshots of those or records of those there, any other sources that you pull, any other ancillary material, whether it's photographs, other news reports, videos, any material that basically you want to be able to trace back to at some point, drop all of that in this single repository, name it really clearly for yourself. And then as you're going through too, in your reporting, if you can annotate your own draft, understanding, of course, that drafts can change a lot in the course of reporting. But if you annotate for yourself as you go, including things like timestamps, you will make things much easier for yourself and for your editorial team on the receiving end. And I will just say, at the risk of working myself out of more work, I think when you do this kind of fact-checking process for yourself, you're also freeing up resources at publications for them to pay you to do more reporting, right? So what I mean by that is the clearer and more organized your fact-checking is before it gets to the fact-checker, the less time that the fact-checker has to spend on it, and therefore the less money the publication has to invest in fact-checking, which means it has more money to hire you for another investigative reporting piece or another kind of report. So I think that, you know, when we think about this sort of globally, you can see all of the advantages of taking responsibility for checking your own facts as you go along.
I have a follow-up to that. Just one note for Iris. If you could maybe increase your volume, or if there's anything you can do on your end. They're telling me that the translation sounds a little bit soft. Yeah. So Julie, there's another golden rule that has to do with like reaching out to the sources. But before, about explaining the fact-checking process. But before we go to that one, I think we need to ask the question of whether or not, what is the best practice for fact-checking when it comes to the quotes and things that your sources told you? Do you get the fact-checker on the phone to call them, or do you provide that fact-checker transcripts, audio transcripts of recordings with timestamps? What is the best way to go about it?
So this largely depends on a case-by-case basis and for lots of different reasons. Some of those reasons might be, for example, that we've seen recently in pieces that I've worked on for Palabra, you may have minors who are your subjects, and for lots of different reasons, whether because they may have lived through a traumatic experience, or they may just be difficult to reach, or they may need to be contacted in conjunction with their parents. It's not ideal to necessarily have to go back and speak with them. So what is always ideal is to have audio files of your interviews, if you've conducted interviews by phone or in person, and to have written transcripts of that audio, right? Now, in the end, we'll talk a little bit about what some resources are for transferring audio interviews into written transcripts. And to timestamp those in your annotated draft so that a fact checker can go directly to the section where that quote or where that information was conveyed by your source, and they can just listen to it quickly or look at it quickly in the transcript and check it. I can't emphasize enough how important the timestamps are, because we will often receive audio from writers that will be hours and hours of audio. And it's not, again, it's not a cost-effective approach for me to sit and listen to all of the audio. I want to be really targeted in what I'm listening to, and then pull my scope back and listen to more if I need to for some reason to clarify. But I think that that's one really important piece. The other piece is that, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently in so many different contexts, but particularly in the context of fact checking, memory is a weird thing, right? The way that we tell our own stories is very strange. The way we tell our histories evolves as we evolve, right? And so we recently had a story at Palabra where the way that someone told their story, and it's not necessarily that the second version that they came to us with after publication was more true or less true than the first version that they told us, but they had come to some sort of new understanding of their own story, or they were telling it in a different way. And so I think every chance or every contact that you have with a source introduces a new opportunity for a new story to be introduced, right? And when that happens, then as the fact checker, I need to go back to the editor and to the writer and say, all right, this new information has presented itself. What do we do with this? And it can be something really simple, like what we were dealing with earlier today, where a source isn't sure that they want to share their name, or it can be something much more serious and complex. So I think that I would prefer, as the fact checker, to not have to contact a source to follow up with them with a phone call. Sometimes that's inevitable, and sometimes it's the most respectful, responsible thing to do. But I think that this really underscores the importance of audio, of having the original audio record, because then the writer can also go back to the source and say, we spoke about this on August 29th. And at that time you said, XYZ. And so now you're saying ABC. Can we talk a little bit about that? Right. But if you have the audio record of it, you have this sort of unassailable point of departure from which to work.
Yes, and I want to follow up on that in a couple of things. I see that we're starting to have questions. I want to let everybody know we're going to reserve about 20-25 minutes at the end to go through more of your questions, invite Johnny to ask. And Anjana, welcome. I'm so happy that you're here. I know her. She's asking something that we've sort of been touching on in terms of, if you don't have a fact checker helping you in the organization, how do you become your own fact checker? We could sort of recap in a minute some of these points that we've been making about best practices, because we've been kind of touching on it in a variety of ways. One thing that I'm thinking about when somebody tells you different stories, because if you have to interview someone over a period of time, inevitably they will go back to something they told you before. You realize they're telling it differently, and then you're looking at both transcripts and recordings. What helped me was also to create a timeline for the narrative of the story, right? If it's something that happened over a period of time, like I sadly did a story on a suicide from a young man many years ago. So I worked all the way from the moment he was born to the many moments they were incarcerated, to their graduation, to contacts with the police, and started trying to use those timestamps that were attached to a document in a folder to help guide me through the other information that I was receiving that people were giving me in their interviews. But I think even if your story is a story that you work only for a month or 2 months, if it has narrative that involves the passage of time, I don't think that it hurts to kind of line it up so you could visually see what happened where. So it's like an additional thing on the side beyond the fact checking, but it's just for you to kind of be able to see if something that adds up. But wait a minute. If you said
And I
you
know
were
the highlights reel, right? I also think as the reporter, it's absolutely okay to say to somebody, I need some ancillary material, and not because you're casting doubt on the veracity of what they're telling you, right? But we had a fact check recently where someone posted bond for their mother, right? And there was some question about whether it was 2014 or 2015. And because I do a lot of immigration advocacy work, I knew that this person, if they paid the bond, they should have a bond receipt, right? Because you have to hang on to this if you want to get your money back at some point in the future. And so that's one piece of information that we could ask for, to say, it's really hard. So, I mean, just to like empathize also with your subject and say, gosh, like, especially when it's an experience that's been so fraught for you and so emotional, it's really easy to get tangled up with our dates. And would you mind sharing a picture of the bond receipt with us? You could do something similar for like high school graduations or other key moments in a person's life where there's likely to be some sort of physical documentation. It can be really helpful in really establishing the truth, right, of that particular fact.
So I want to recap, before I recap a few of the points that you said, I think we forgot to mention the importance, in the case you have to call the sources, to let the sources know that a fact checker, someone that they haven't met, is going to call them. Because
Yes.
it might take them a little bit back. If it's a politician, an attorney, they might be more familiar with the process. But if it's someone that's never been interviewed before, we had a situation with the story we did in Mexico, right, with people that had long COVID, and very kindly, these persons that had long COVID, they told us, well, why are you asking me these questions? Don't you trust the reporter? And we had to explain to them, we trust them. This is just an additional process to make sure that we didn't change anything, misinterpret anything, because it could be perceived that way too. So you should let them know ahead of time. I don't know if you wanted to add something more to that, Julie.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the sources and a lot of the stories that we publish at Palabra are about people who have experiences of profound trauma, right? Or profound loss or profound suffering. And so every time they tell their story, again, there's an aspect of it that can be re-traumatizing. There's an aspect for some people that can also be cathartic. But I think as the journalist or the reporter, it's really important, as you said, to set the subject up for the possibility that they may be contacted by the fact checker, and to really explain why that is, to really underscore this is for your protection. It's out of our respect for you. It may be that it's very likely to be the case that the fact checker is going to ask you questions that I've already asked you or that we've talked about extensively. This is really just to protect you and make sure that the information is correct. And thank you so much for being willing to do that. And really, I think flagging for the fact checker any sorts of information that may make that contact more comfortable and more safe for the source is really important. We have a lot of folks, for example, that we may report about who I would like to know how they identify their gender pronouns, for example, before I call them so that I address them appropriately. If somebody has some sort of trauma that they have shared with a journalist, just to say, I need you to be like especially sensitive about this particular area. I think that, all of those things are really useful for both the source and for the fact checker.
I wanted to add just really quick because something when I talk to students, I was mentioning this before we started the webinar, like today, I wanted them to remember something that's key, and that's accuracy. So I kind of put it into the context of real estate, because when we're talking about real estate, we always say location, location, location. And today I said, when we're talking about journalism, it's accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. Because, a lot of the points that you're making, it's what we strive for, minimizing error, minimizing bias, and making sure that for the most part, what we're reporting is the truth. And, the truth sometimes can be subjective. And that's why a lot of the things that you have mentioned, like the timeline, a Google Drive, keeping records is so important, because it'll help once you really sit down to write, to have a clear picture of where you're going. And just like Julie said, it's also not a protection just for the interviewee, but also the interviewer. So I think that excellent points, and yeah, accuracy, and I always um, say, we might not have the truth at 100%, but it is our job to try and get it as close to 100% as we can. So
Julie, I want to go back. Thank you, Johnny. To those very practical and specific things that you were saying for the reporters that won't have someone wonderful as you helping at the end come verify. I think when we're new or even after a long time, we have common mistakes we make when we're dealing with facts and numbers and studies and research. Beyond the organizing, maybe you could talk about some areas in which reporters who want to improve their accuracy can focus on to sort of go and after the fact check themselves, right? And be like, is this study too old, or did I, that kind of stuff.
So Anjana, you asked a great question. And I think, the process that we're describing, Valeria and I are working together with writers on pieces that in many cases have developed over many months, right? Sometimes even a year or more. And I think the process that we're describing can be challenging if you're a newsroom reporter or a reporter for online outlets where there's a really fast news cycle. But at the same time, I still think some of the basics that we're talking about here today are still applicable and manageable for you. And so I would say that for me, and again, this is very much about you adapting to whatever platforms and tools and resources work best for you. But I like to work, whether I'm working as a writer or whether I'm working as a fact checker, in a Google document that I can share with the editor and the fact checker at some point. And I just, for myself, I highlight everything that I think is a fact or needs to be rooted in some sort of source. And I'll make myself a comment bubble that says, this is what my source is. So whether that's an audio transcript, whether that's some sort of online source or other piece of information, I'll make a note in there so that I know how to go back and find that source if I need to. And I think, as a quick turnaround reporter, you may not be able to do things like really go through and timestamp everything in the way that I was talking about earlier. And I think that's okay if your reporting cycle is more accelerated, you're not always going to be able to do that. It's not time efficient for you. But if you know the basic audio file where you can find something, at least to narrow down for yourself as much as possible how to get back to your original source is a really important practice.
Talking about numbers and statistics and research, what are some common mistakes that you see that we make as reporters? Because you see so many stories, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think dates are a common mistake, wrong dates. I think it's very complex, right? There's a lot of things like just sort of misnaming anything that involves lawmaking, politicians, processes for how laws get passed, sort of the stage at which a law is or a bill is in process. I see a lot of errors in that area. Often one of the things that I am concerned about a lot is how old statistics are. You see me talk about this a lot, Valeria, so you're probably like tired of hearing about it. But I think if you're citing research that's older than 3 to 5 years old, that can be problematic unless you're referring to it in a more historical context, right? So I'll give you just an example that's not from Palabra. I just finished fact checking a piece about oil exploration in Ecuador in indigenous territories. And the writer was talking about, she said, since 2012, 70 new oil wells have been drilled in indigenous territory. And she linked to a source, and the source was from 2014. And I said, well, you know, since 2012 to 2014, well, what's happened from 2014 to 2023, right? And it's not that you can't use that source or that data point, but if you use it, it has to be put into its proper context, right? Between 2012 and 2014, 70 oil wells were drilled. And then that sort of, to me, begs the question, well, how many have been drilled since then, right? Can we find more recent data? Similarly, in that same article, there was a reference to the poverty rates in this community. And again, the data was like maybe 8 years old. And I said, well, you know, it's probably true that it hasn't, the income hasn't increased incredibly given sort of global trends, but it's worth, I think, finding a more recent source. And I think just like pushing ourselves to really say, I mean, life moves fast, right? So it really pushing ourselves to look at, are we really sourcing the most accurate contemporary data possible?
Just really quick on that point is also transparency. Transparency in the sense what you're using could be the most recent, or transparency, like Julie, you just said it, putting it into the right context. You know, maybe these are the most recent numbers that we can find, because it's just a snapshot of something in time. But yeah, I agree with that. Sometimes I use material that might be from 2017, and it might seem like it's close enough, but between 2017 and 2023, things can change in a huge way. So you know, transparency just for the reader, the audience, and again, you know, helping the as a writer or content creator, making sure that the audience understands this is why we're using it, because it might be the most recent, or because some of the other stuff that we are finding as we fact check might not be, let's say, trustworthy enough. So we want to make sure that we present also the data that is trustworthy. So yeah, that's an excellent
Yeah,
point.
it's all about situating it within its proper
Yes.
context, right?
Right. Yeah.
And to follow up on that, also transparency about who's the source, because we are fact checking an article in which it came up. You pointed out, Julie, that some of the sources were activist organizations, so they had a particular interest on the topic. And so how are you going to take that study, you know, with a bit of a grain of sand? You need to know where it's coming from and decide, correct?
Or just situating it and naming that this organization is an activist organization. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, right? But it's really being clear, this is not a nonpartisan group that is generating this information. I mean, I know this organization and I trust their work, but I think it's really important to be clear about sort of the motives of this particular group so that the reader can come to their own conclusions and decisions.
Yeah, and this is a sideline, but I know it's a passion of yours. It's also the diversity of the voices.
Yeah.
It's not so much about fact checking, but like just having representation of marginalized groups, people of color, women, the LGBTQ community, and the experts, right?
I think Palabra's done an incredible job with that. I think generally, certainly compared to a decade ago, I'm not sure, did things freeze for a minute?
Yes, you were frozen for a second. If you wanna, you were saying Palabra is wonderful.
Yeah, I was saying, you can stick with that. I was saying, Palabra has done a really great job with that. And I think generally sort of across the journalism landscape in the United States, I'd say we're better than we were 10 years ago in that regard. But I still think when we're sitting down as reporters and thinking about how we're going to frame up a story, to be really deliberate in thinking about how do I diversify my pool of sources, right? And I think this is where your editor is a vital resource. This is where NAHJ can be a really great resource as well. And so I think it is a passion of mine, and I think it's important to think about that.
And really quick, again, you touch on something that we always strive for, of course, in every newsroom, because we always, it might sound like a cliche, Sorry for my dogs. It might sound like a cliche, but fair and balanced. Fair and balanced also going along with the whole diversity and different points of view. Because we always talk, we want to make sure it's fair and balanced, and that we have not just one side, but we have the other side. And if we don't have two sides, then we have five sides. Then yeah, we try to incorporate all of them into that story, into that article, or into that content that we're working on. So I'm glad that you brought that, because I know maybe the new term is a lot about adding voices, but at the same time, it's always been there. It's always been about being fair and balanced.
Yep.
And trying to paint a picture with as much sides as we can, so that the viewer or the reader, they can make their own decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in a way, kind of what we were trying to get at is in choosing sources of experts. Traditionally it's always been white men, right? You go to interview a university professor talking about, neuroscience, a man, and then, or even about topics that have to do with women, a man. And so, striving to have that representation is not necessarily part of the fact-checking process, but it's just like one of those things that I think comes up as you are reviewing a story, as you spend more time with the story at the end. If you're lucky enough to have time, and you say, are we missing some voices here for diversity to talk about this specific issue? Maybe they're on the same side of the issue, but could we have a woman or someone that has a different background? I wanted to share a little slide before we have to move on to questions that just will allow Julie to just free talk about things that you remember from your experience on some of the fact checks you've done for Palabra, and then just visually show you some resources too. Let me share here. This is always a challenge for me. Thumbs up if you see it. All right. Oops, doesn't let me. Okay, there we go. So this is a story, Julie, that you actually fact check in Spanish. This is the English version. Sorry, let me go back. Tell us a little bit about the challenge with it.
Well, first of all, this was a really, really lengthy story. Many thousands of words. The main protagonist in the story, whom you see here, Cesar Lepe, lives here in Mexico, has long COVID, is very much an activist, and is very active in trying to get attention and services for long COVID patients in Mexico. And at the same time, because he has long COVID, his energy is quite low. And so Alice Pipitone, the writer for this piece, the journalist for this piece, was very concerned about the extent to which I would be contacting him in person, just out of respect for his health. And so that made really, I think, the annotation and Alice's meticulous provision of a really organized fact check folder to be all the more important here, so that when I did get in touch with Cesar, that it would be for really like the most important pieces that I really wanted to triple check, right? So that was really the best, most respectful use of his time. And that it was on his own terms, that it could be by phone or it could be via WhatsApp text messages. This piece was incredibly complex because it required not just reviewing the audio and transcripts and checking with Cesar and the other protagonists in the piece, but also really pouring through loads and loads of scientific research, medical opinions. I mean, I think this piece is so illustrative, and I'm so glad that you chose this piece for this workshop, because it is an area about which we're still, as a society, even experts, right, are still learning an incredible amount all the time. There are still so many questions. And so, as Johnny was talking earlier about accuracy, this is a piece where, I think we were confronted with, you don't know what you don't know, right? If you don't know how to ask the right questions as the fact checker, how are you going to get the right answers, right? And so I think the journalist had to have an immense amount of patience. I think we all had to have a lot of immense patience with each other. and had to really reach beyond the sources for the piece itself to really go deep and try to confirm whether the conclusions that the journalist had reached in the piece were accurate. At the same time as we were understanding that this is an area of medicine that's still developing, and we could find out weeks after publication that something has changed.
What is your advice if this is like Anjana was saying, and I know she sometimes works on pieces for, you know, several months. What is your advice if you don't have someone as brilliant as you to help you? Is it okay to turn on to like a university professor, or, you know, to run your questions about the validity of a particular study? Is it, you know, is it reviewed? You know, how
I think, you know, reach out to all the people that you can. I think most people, I think one of the joys of fact checking for me is that most people love to share their knowledge and their expertise. And all they want is for somebody to listen to them. So, especially in an area like long COVID, where, you know, there's still so much emerging. I think people were really happy to speak with us about their expertise and their questions and sort of confirming things for us. I find this to be true sort of universally. I will say a couple years ago, I fact checked a cover story for Audubon magazine about an environmental activist. And the story is by a really respected white American journalist whose Spanish, I'm not sure, is fluent at all. I could be wrong about that. But one of my concerns as I got deeper into the piece was there was a lot about indigenous land rights in Colombia. And I knew like this much about that, right? That subject is so highly specific. And I went to the editor and I said, you know, I really feel like I'm out of my depth with this particular piece of the article. And I feel like it's so crucial to get this right. Who else can we call in? Do you have the resources to call somebody else in on this? And what was the joy for me about that piece was that they did call in a Colombian journalist who also does fact checking, and she specializes in indigenous land rights. And I learned a ton from her about like, what are the questions that I should even be asking, right? And I think that just made the piece so much better from the perspective of all of us. But she was paid for her work, but it was so, I think she was so pleased that and I was too, that the publication would invest in that. And it was, I think at the end, it was just profoundly respectful also of the community from which this activist came. So yeah, the TLDR of that is reach out to people. Experts love to talk. They want to tell you everything they know. Lean on them.
Can I add something really quick? Because when we were talking about experts, that just reminded me, and maybe we already touched upon it, but vetting experts,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that is also key for us as journalists. And I think you touched upon it. Sometimes they do have a vested interest, maybe. That doesn't diminish their quality sometimes as an expert. But can you tell us a little bit about that? You know, how do you, when you fact check, how do you vet an expert?
I thank you for saying this, Johnny. And I think, you know, I'm thinking back to what you were saying before we started the webinar about being on the class you were teaching earlier today about misinformation and disinformation too. I think this is getting harder and harder because more conservative, right-wing, malevolent forces are enshrouding their experts and their expertise in really progressive looking clothing, right? And so the kinds of vetting that we might have done even, I would say even 3 years ago, is quite different from what we might do now. So I think look at, for example, if you're looking at, I mean, the fact that somebody's a professor at a university doesn't necessarily mean that they're legit, right? I think you need to look at sort of the whole body of their work. You can often find that on their faculty bio, sort of see like what other institutions are they affiliated with? What boards do they sit on? And again, as you said, this is so important. It doesn't mean that their conclusions or their input is invalid, but it does mean that you need to situate that, right? Like you need to give the reader the tools and the information to say, so-and-so who's affiliated with whatever, conservative think tank, blah, 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 says XYZ, right? so that then the reader can say, oh, okay, well, maybe I want to take this with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's great advice. I very quickly, we're going to move to questions. So start putting your questions in the Q&A or the chat. Julie, could you tell us what we're looking at right now? What
Sure. This is a series, part of a series by Zaide Sanchez about pesticide use in farm workers. And here you'll see everything that's highlighted here is something that I checked. So pretty much every word except for like it and the. And you'll see here that I am going back to whatever the sourcing is. So an earlier version of this story might have shown Zaide's annotations actually about where I could find the source information. And then what I do is I go back to those sources and I'll say, as you see here, other details in this paragraph confirmed via Yanelli transcript, timestamp 402, right? The piece may draw upon other sources as well. This one had a lot of like reports from the state government and from municipal governments. And so I would check those as well. What you're seeing right here is actually, I mean, you might be better placed to talk about this, Valeria, but it's a sample fact check folder that Valeria made for one of her pieces.
Oh, wait, 2019. This is not necessarily the best, okay? But it's just, you know, Anjana, just to get back to your question, you know, you are super organized, so I'm sure you're already doing that, right? Just having a folder. Let's say if you have 15 key people in the story, I created a folder for each person. I have one for Frankie Madrid, and then inside that folder, I will have, you know, gosh, he definitely had a very rough life, but you know, Frankie deportation means all his documents, you know, arrest videos, and then inside like FOIA. So to the right, what you see in is some of the context of the FOIA, you know, municipal court cases, warrants, memorandums, trial transcripts, all of that stuff. So then I will go to the story and then I will say, in this folder, in this document, in this page, you could find this answer. But if I don't have anybody checking for me, this I still need to have, because I need to be able to go back and forth as I'm writing the story to be like, let me look again at what the judge said in that case, you know? And then at the very end, I think double check myself, do my own process of reviewing and making sure I have everything right, because sometimes you change things along so much that then you inadvertently insert errors. Now, talking about resources, Julie put together a list that we're going to share with you of a lot. I touched this and it moves away. I'm not going to touch it. Of a lot of resources. I don't know if you want to comment on some of these and the transcript services, Julie.
Sure. So because Palabra primarily focuses on publishing articles about Latino communities and individuals inside the United States, this list of resources is very US centric, in case you were wondering why that was the case. But these are websites and sources that we rely upon a lot at Palabra for checking things like when somebody says, this place is in the northeastern part of the United States. Okay, well, let's not just assume that. Let's go double check that. Let's check the distances. Sometimes we'll have to convert kilometers to miles. If you're looking for it, a lot of times a writer will make a claim that we all sort of generally believe to be true, especially for progressive folks, but maybe we need to root it in some scholarly research. So Google Scholar can be good for that. Ballotpedia is my go-to for anything related to electoral voting history, party affiliations, names of elected officials, their voting records, super useful. And then we reference law cases a lot. You can read entire law cases and decisions, and also get a compendium of federal and state laws at the justicia.com. And then these others are can be really helpful for you to, even if it's not something that the writer necessarily has provided sourcing for, but to help give yourself some visual context. The Library of Congress and National Archives have great photography resources that I think can be very helpful. And then these other Census Bureau and Centers for Disease Control, Mayo Health Clinic are all great for population and health information. And then these last two are both about spelling of words and the origins of words.
For transcripts, you said that you were going to mention that. Are there any places that are free? Because transcripts can be expensive.
Don't know of any. And frankly, transcription services, so many of you probably already know about the main ones. Trint, Trint, Otter are the ones that we see the most at Palabra. You know, I mean, and they're really fallible, right? So I think we will see transcripts and there'll be tons of errors. I think don't get hung up on that. Don't worry about that, because as long as you've got the transcript and the audio, if there's any question about what's in the written transcript, as long as you've got a timestamp, I can go back to the original audio and just double check. And Valeria just mentioned a couple other Sonics and a script as well. And if anybody knows of any free ones, let us know, because I don't.
Yeah, I think there may be, but like we'll get back on that. I think some reporters use a couple of them. Google has something. I don't see any questions yet here, but like feel free to start jumping in with questions. We put in there the email for Julie that generously is giving it in case any of you want to follow up with her, or if you have need any advice on the fact-checking process. She's amazing, or you just want to chat with her.
Well,
And
I'll ask a question when you get a
yes,
chance.
yes, Johnny, dale.
I was gonna ask you about public sources, because many times we rely on a lot of public documents. I know that sometimes they differ by state. So I don't know if you have any places that we can maybe look for public documents that maybe you use a lot or that you've used in the past. Because they have a lot of good information sometimes just to verify data.
Yeah, that's a good question. It just varies so much by jurisdiction. I mean, things that we've looked at, for example, are like land titles. We've looked for like individuals' net worth. Something that I look at a lot are 990s of nonprofit organizations. So if you're trying to substantiate, for example, as I did on a fact check recently, that a particular foundation or nonprofit has donated X amount of dollars over the past 10 years. Like you can go to ProPublica, actually has a great public facing site where you can check any registered nonprofit organization's 990s for their whole history. And you can go through those and you can see, what are their employees getting paid? Whom are they making donations to? So I think those are useful. And then Valeria just put a couple more, which are PACER, the US courts. For those of you working in migration and immigration, ICE's detainee locator can be helpful. They have some other tools that I use a lot. But it depends pretty much on the subject and also the jurisdiction.
And we do have a question here. It says Giovanni Cordova, same last name. How can journalists integrate real-time fact-checking processes without compromising reporting speed for scenarios like breaking news?
Yeah, I think this is probably the biggest challenge and the most common one. Again, I think it's really about creating like a kind of a bookmark for yourself, right? So like if as you're reporting, you can just make a note for yourself about this is where I think I need to follow up and check, or this is a source or a resource that I know to be reliable, but you just sort of put a pin in that for yourself so that if there's any question about it later, you can go back to it. I think unfortunately, it's not a realistic scenario for many of us. If we're working in breaking news or quick turnaround news, we can't fact check everything, right? And even if we're specialists in a particular beat. So I think it's really just about having some of these resources that we've talked about today at your fingertips and really just sort of putting a pin on that in your working draft so that if needed, you can go back and double check. I mean, I think Valeria and I talk about this a lot. Like I think Valeria and I are still traditionalists, maybe in the sense that we don't want to have to go back and issue corrections. We just want to get it right the first time. but I think generally, I mean, I think even legacy outlets like the New York Times have become really comfortable with issuing corrections. I mean, sort of like at a ridiculous level, actually. So I think, to the extent that, you do the best that you can. And then if you have to go back, you've made a note for yourself about where you can start to pull the thread to figure out what the correct fact is.
I
For
would like to
breaking,
add, okay, could I add something about
sure,
that?
go
Because
ahead.
I used to work for AP and had to cover breaking news sometimes. It was always a rule confirmed with at least 3 sources,
Yep.
right? So I know some stuff is not gonna be in your beat, you're gonna be thrown into it. But if you cover a beat, it's really like you gotta anticipate in a way, have those sources at hands by having good relationships with people in police departments, at the court. I cannot emphasize enough, if you're covering a court case, if you're covering legislation, if you're covering anything that has to do with crime, go get the records. Just jump in your car and go straight to the court and be the first one to get the record, the court record, to get the police report, because that makes a world of a difference between just simply reporting because the police gave you a press release versus what the report says. Usually it's going to have more information, it's going to have more contacts, and the same thing with anything that is a court filing. And I mean, I cannot emphasize how big of a difference that made for me. Reporters that were not doing that were making a lot of mistakes and the reporting was incomplete. Reporters that went for the record right away were the ones that were, doing a better job, basically.
I
Yeah.
also would say that with your triangulation of sources, that rule of thumb of like the 3 sources, to when you're on a breaking news beat, to be really clear with your sources. Like, I need to hear back from you by XYZ time, right? So that you've given them the opportunity to respond, and if they haven't, they've missed the boat.
And you can still report that. That's
Right,
the other thing.
exactly,
But you
right.
can always say,
We
we
attempted to
tried.
contact A, B, and
Yes.
C and didn't hear back from them before deadline.
Yes, and something really important sometimes as a local reporter is keeping good rapport with your sources, because many times you do have sources and contacts maybe at the courthouse. And sometimes, and speaking of reports, when you go to the courthouse and get the report, sometimes the report leaves you with more questions. So that's always something to, you're always looking for maybe contradictory information. Maybe there it says, it happened at such and such time, but maybe you have an eyewitness account and they're telling you it happens a lot, like with shootings, where they say, oh, I heard 30
Mhm.
shots, and maybe the report says it was only 5. So again, you're trying to minimize error when it comes to breaking news, because at the same time it's kind of developing, it's happening. So you report on what you have up to that point, and we talked about it earlier. It's just a snapshot in time up to that point. So it's just like a different animal, a different breed, as opposed to what Palabra is doing, which is more long form. So you have probably a little more time to verify before you actually hit the play button and have the report online.
Yeah, no, and it's scary. Julie, like as we are approaching the end of the workshop, anybody has a final question, but is there anything that you think you will want to add that maybe we forgot to touch upon? Oh, yeah, I have an idea. When the sources give you the wrong information, and how do you, when you realize, oops, they're saying this, how do you broach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated because stakes are different in different situations, right? If it's someone being inaccurate about their own personal story, I think that can be even more touchy than somebody being wrong about a sort of a hard and fast fact, like somebody from, let's say, a public relations office, right? Because the personal nature of a personal story or personal fact can make somebody very sensitive, right? And I think a lot of times, one of the things that we see a lot is that someone will feel very comfortable with a reporter and will have developed rapport and they will be very open. And then when we're going through the fact checking process, they kind of want to reel it back, right? They have suddenly realized, oh, my story is going to be out in the world, and maybe I don't want this particular piece of it exposed. So sometimes it's not even about an inaccuracy that they've shared, it's about an accuracy that they want to take back. And so I think at the end of the day, and I think Valeria, you're extraordinary in this way, you know, as Johnny said, it's about protecting rapport and it's about protecting sources. We never want the story so badly that we want someone to be harmed in the process of our publication, right? And so I think it's really working as a team editorially with the editor, the fact checker, the reporter, and with the source. And also really just sort of internally grouping up and being like, okay, this is, I think you are great at making room for a lot of different opinions. And then we sort of sort through those together and say, all right, what's the most ethical thing to do? What's the most responsible thing to do? And then circling back to the source, I think is a general good practice.
Yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot with people's immigration status and also with teenagers. I mean, we just had that happen today with a story that's running next week, in which, and it could happen to you as a reporter, you know, that they call you and they say, you know, I don't feel comfortable pulling my full name. I know I told you it was okay and with my immigration status, but I talked with my grandma and she persuaded me, you know. And at that point, I mean, they say yes, and you have them on record, and then you recorded them. And you can be, I don't want to use a bad word, and be like, no, you can't change your mind now. Or you could remember, you know, what kind of reporter you want to be and what kind of relationship you want to have with the community, and like minimize the harm to that person, because we all know, let's just face it, that anybody that is coming fully out with their full name and their immigration status is always taking a risk. And if they want to do that, they have agency, right? That's what we always discuss with you, Julie. They have a right to do so. We can decide for them, oh no, let me protect you. We can be paternalistic like that, but we also shouldn't be responsible if they change their mind, or if we get a feeling that they're not very clear about the consequences of revealing that status, right? So it's a fine balance.
Right. I would just say one more sort of observation is that I think part of our job for all of us, regardless of where we are in the editorial cycle, whether we're the reporter or the editor or the fact checker, is to help our sources understand risk, right? And I think we've certainly had examples at Palabra, but I've worked on other stories as well where maybe the writer wanted the story so badly that they didn't communicate the potential risk to the person or didn't assess the risk. And so I think that is something that we need to be interrogating, and we need to be in conversation with our editors about. And I'm sure everybody on this call is doing that, but I think it's something that to me, I think is so important with vulnerable communities and people who've often been left out or overlooked by certain narratives. I think to the extent that we want them to be the owners and the voice of their own narratives, I think it's really important to have those conversations about risk as well.
And you mentioned earlier, you know, part of being ethical, you mentioned the word empathy. And so yeah, sometimes we need to be empathetic journalists as we go through our jobs.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that we're biased, but it's just like, you know, it means that we see the humanity in other people, and
right.
And that's also like important for building trust, and journalism is in a crisis of trust. And I think a lot of you here are journalists who work in different communities, and you have that very precious trust. I plugged in there a little promotion for Palabra, for a story that ran today, actually out of Arizona. We've been working on this one for quite a while, and Julie was a fact checker on this one. So check it out. I just want to say really, thank you, Julie. Thank you very, very much. I mean, it's always awesome to be in conversation with you. I just feel so grateful that like you're part of the Palabra family. And anybody that works with you is really lucky to have you. I think you bring a lot of wisdom. So, and you're good talking. And Johnny.
I love talking shop about process. So this was a joy. Thank you.
Iris también, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Para que lo sepan, Iris también colabora con Palabra en traducciones, y Iris está con nosotros desde Honduras. Y bueno, y Johnny, te dejo que tú pongas el broche de oro.
Gracias. Thanks. No, I'm again very excited. You know that now I know Julie and I know Iris. We're here in Phoenix, in Arizona, and also thank you to Valeria. You know, because I just think that her vehicle of Palabra is just such a wonderful vehicle for journalists. It's I always see that the stories that are covered are like passion projects. I always say that sometimes you find stories that you're not going to find anywhere else. So again, I want to plug it too, you know, that if you haven't yet, just Google it, Palabra, and it'll take you to the website. And then there's also several podcasts. You know, if you scroll down that page, you're going to find much more, a lot more resources and a lot of more things. And of course, we want to make sure that Palabra grows. So you know, we want it to grow, get bigger. So please, you know, check out our stories, check out our reports, help us share on social media, and you know, thank you again, everybody who joined us, and tell everybody that we're working on this series. We don't have a date for the next one yet. We don't have a topic yet, but again, your feedback is very important because it'll help us decide, you know, maybe something that you want us to tackle, and we'll make sure to bring that topic to the table. So everybody who's joined us, thank you very much. Valeria, Julie, Iris, and thank you from wherever you're joining us. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Gracias.